It seems to me that thousands of the salmon ascending these small mountain streams never can spawn from sheer want of room, or if they do, it must be under most unfavorable circumstances. At the end of the pebble stream was a waterfall beyond which no fish could by any possibility pass. Having arrived at this barrier to all further progress, there they obstinately remained. Weeks were spent in washing them, but I never in a single instance saw one turn back and endeavor to seek a more congenial watercourse, but crowded from beyond by fresh arrivals, they died by the score, and drifting slowly along in time reached the larger stream. It was a strange and novel sight to see the three moving lines of fish, the dead and dying in the eddies and slack water along the banks, the living breasting the current in the center, blindly pressing on to perish behind like their kindred. Even in streams where a successful deposition of the ova have been accomplished, there never appears, as far as my observations have gone, any disposition in the parent fish to return to the sea. Their instinct still prompts them to keep swimming upstream, until you often find them with their noses worn quite off, their heads bruised and battered, fins and tails ragged and torn, bodies emaciated, thin and flabby, bright silvery tints dull and leaden in hue, a livid red streak extending along each side from head to tail, in which large ulcerous sores have eaten into their very vitals. The Indians say all the salmon that come up to spawn die, but if all do not die, I have no hesitation in saying that very few spring salmon ever reach the salt water after ascending the rivers to spawn. Why there should be this marvelous waste of salmon in the rivers of the northwest, I am somewhat puzzled to imagine. The distance the fish have to travel from the sea upstream, or the obstacles they may have to overcome, have clearly nothing to do with their dying. In the Chilliwack River, the distance from the sea is not over 200 miles, and that clear from any kind of hindrance, and yet they die in thousands. In the Columbia, they ascend 1,000 miles to the Kettle Falls, and they have been caught many hundred miles above that. Still, they die just the same as in the shorter streams. Up the Snake River, they push their way to the Great Shoshone Falls, over 1,000 miles against a rocky stream, but perish there just as they do in the Sunmass and Chilliwack rivers, which are close to the sea. Unlike the salmon in our own streams, the spring salmon in the northwestern waters spawn in midsummer, when the water is at its lowest temperature and greatest flood height, from the melting snow, as there is no impediment or hindrance to prevent them returning to the sea. Why do they die in northwestern waters? In my opinion, from sheer starvation. Careful observations made at the various Indian fishing stations and extending over a long space of time have quite convinced me that salmon, I more particularly allude to the spring fish, never feed in after leaving saltwater. My reasons for thus thinking are, first, no salmon, as far as I know, has ever attempted to take a bait of any kind in the fresh water above the tideway. The Indians all say that the salmon never eat when in the rivers, and I can never discover that any recorded instance or even tradition of a salmon being taken with bait. I tried every lure I could think of to tempt these lordly salmon. The most killing salmon flies of Scotch, Irish, and English ties, thrown in the most approved fashion, were trailed close to their noses. Such flies as would have coaxed any experienced salmon in the civilized world of waters to forget his caution. Hooks cunningly baited with live fish, aquatic larvae, and winged insects were scorned, and not even honored with a sniff. Others of the commission also tried their powers of fascination, but with equally unsuccessful results. I have opened a very large number of salmon at various Indian fishing stations on their first arrival, and during every stage of their wasting vitality and after death had ended their sufferings, and not in a solitary instance did I ever discover the trace of food in the stomach or intestinal canal, but in every case where a salmon has taken in the tideway or salt water, I invariably found the remains of the small fish and marine animals in its stomach. And in the estuaries and long inland canals that so strangely intersect the coastline of British Columbia, salmon are readily and easily caught with hook and line, clearly showing to my mind and that whilst in salt and brackish water, the northwestern spring salmon feed and fatten, but after quitting their ocean haunts for the cold, fresh water, they starve, waste, and die as a lamp goes out from sheer want of oil. Surely, where hundreds of salmon are split in a day, as at the Kettle Falls, it is fair to assume that if they took any food, by chance, a fish would be caught immediately after its meal, with enough evidence in the stomach to prove the fact that it had broken its fast. But such proof is never discoverable. Digestion would scarcely be more rapid in the rivers than it is in the ocean and estuary, where we know they eat. Open a salmon and examine its stomach at any time, caught either in nets or with hook and line, and food in various stages of digestion will invariably be found. Another proof that they undergo a rigid and persistent Lent is found in the rapid wasting of all the tissues that go on during their sojourn in fresh water, allowing for the consumption of material requisite for the purposes of reproduction, and the wear and tear consequent on making their way up stiff currents, leaping falls, and laboriously toiling up rocky canyons. Still, I contend, if only a partial equivalent was resupplied in the shape of food, waste would not go on to the actual death of the mussel, that slow way in large pieces, as the exhausted fish makes feeble efforts to struggle on, dying at last a loathsome mass of rotting animal matter. Sores in both male and female fish often arise from injuries inflicted by the teeth of a jealous adversary, but these wounds are utterly different from the sloping ulcer arising, as I believe, from the sheer lack of vital force. These salmon veritably consume themselves and perish when life's stove burns out for want of fuel to keep it alight. In August, the Chilliwack River becomes perfectly endurable from the quantities of dead fish floating down. I had with me a splendid retriever that, to my disgust and annoyance, used to amuse himself during my absence from the tent by swimming in with the floating salmon, bringing them ashore, and safely storing them in my canvas dwelling. And on my return, I discovered a heap of fish, the stench from which was beyond human endurance. It fastened out from the tent, he piled them up at the door. All the lessons bestowed on him failed to convince him of his folly. He struck to his disagreeable habit with a perseverance worthy of a better cause. Arriving a little later than the preceding is a smaller fish, which I believe to be the salmon possidens, weak-toothed salmon, of Sir J. Richardson, the red char of Lewis and Clark, but the red they allude to is a color every one of a different species acquire after being a short time in the rivers. The fish seldom attains a weight over 3 to 5 pounds, and it is called by the Indians at the Salmon Leap of Colville on the Columbia Stozen. It is a very handsome fish, back nearly straight, a light sea greenish color, sides and belly silver white, tail very forked, fins and tail devoid of any spots. The teeth are wide apart and not strangely implanted. I was supposed at first to think that they were young of some other species, but the Indians are positive they are not, and they spawn much as the others do, in a small stream or tributary to the Chilliwack River. a mountain torrent on the west side of the Cascade flowing into the Fraser, on the banks of which I was for a long time encamped, and up which the salmon come in great numbers. I amused myself watching this species of salmon deposit their spawn. I was in August, the water clear as a crystal, the bottom of fine brown gravel, a trench that looked about 3 or 4 inches deep and 3 feet long was muddled out by the noses of the females. A female fish poised herself over the trench, head upstream, and by a rapid vibration of her fins, kept herself nearly still. This lasted about a minute and a minute and a half or 2 minutes, during which time a quantity of OVA were deposited. Then she darted off like an arrow. 4 males at once took her place over the spawn bed, and remained just as the female had done. About 2 minutes on their leaving, 2 females came, and were followed by the males, and as before. The water was about 4 feet deep. I am quite sure from often watching these streams that one spawning bed is used by a great many males and females. It was both curious and interesting to watch the extreme regularity with which the sexes succeeded each other.